So welcome to the seminar of the Astani Department of Civil and Environmental Engineering. Today we are fortunate to have as speakers Tom Jordan. Let me tell you a bit about Tom. Tom is the director of the Southern California Earthquake Center, also known as SCEC. SCEC is a distributed organization involving more than 70 universities and research institutions. Tom's research is focused on system-level models of earthquake processes, earthquake forecasting and forecast evaluations, and full 3D waveform tomography. His scientific interests include continent formations and evolution, mental dynamics, and statistical geology. He has authored approximately 200 scientific publications, including 2 undergraduate textbooks. He is a member of the California Earthquake Prediction Evaluation Council and serves on the governing board of the National Research Council and the board of directors of the Seismological Society of America. Tom received his PhD from Caltech in 1972. He taught at Princeton and at the Scripps Institutions of Oceanography before joining MIT in 1984, where he served as the head of the MIT's Department of Earth, Atmospherics and Planetary Sciences from 1988 to 1998. He moved to USC in 2000, became SCEC director in 2002. He was appointed university professor in 2004. He has been awarded the Milestone and Lehman Medals of the American Geophysical Unions and the Woolert Awards of the Geological Society of America. He is a member of the National Academy of Sciences, the American Academy of Arts and Sciences, and the American Philanthropic Society. So we are very honored today to have Tom Jordan among us, and it's a pleasure to invite Tom to give us the seminar. Tom?
Thank you, JP. Very nice to be here. Come on in. There's some chairs up here, so please come on up.
Yeah. Out there. Please come on in.
One over there.
Out there, one more there.
And okay, so today what I'd like to do is talk a little bit about the use of numerical simulations in trying to forecast strong ground motions, especially here in Southern California. You can see from this view graph that this is, I'm really the spokesperson for a very large collaboration. Actually, several members of that collaboration I think are here. And I'm going to be talking about work that is very much a collaborative activity. I want to talk today about the fact that I'm going to motivate what I say with the news that earthquake, probability of large earthquake in California, our scientific estimates of that are actually going up. And the way you might put it is that the southern San Andreas fault is locked and loaded and ready to roll. Thank you very much. We are now getting to the point where these large-scale numerical simulations can improve our anticipated ground motions. And I'm going to talk a bit about the large-scale computational aspects of some of the very large machines that we're using for these types of calculations. And then I'd like to especially focus on the science rationale and the results of this particular program. So just to put us in perspective, I think this is something most of us in this room know. About 50% of the national seismic risk is concentrated here in Southern California. This is what you're looking at in this graph here is the 30-year probability of having an earthquake greater than some magnitude. This is from the Uniform California Earthquake Rupture forecast that we put out about 2 years ago. And what you can see is that the very high probability of having large earthquakes. We're going to be talking a little bit today about a simulation of a magnitude 8 earthquake. You can see its probability is very low. So part of the reason I want to show you the simulation is not because we think this is the most probable event, but because we are now capable of sort of reaching the outer scale in our simulation capability. And on this map, which shows the, what this basically is showing you is whether fault systems are advanced or delayed relative to their long-term average rate of rupture. And in particular, the southern San Andreas system, which you can see here outlined in red, according to this time-dependent forecasting model, has a higher probability of rupture than the time-independent forecast. And that's because we haven't had earthquakes on the southern San Andreas for many years, the last big one in 1857. New evidence is actually changing this model. We have a revision, USERF 3, that is underway. I just came from a meeting where we were discussing it up in Caltech. And one of the pieces of information that will go into that new model is the fact that along part of the southern San Andreas, this is the Carrizo section, there's now new geologic evidence collected by people like Lisa Grant Ludwig and Ramon Aerosmith that indicate that the recurrence interval for this particular section is much less than we had thought. And what that does is that puts the entire fault in this sort of red band. This is another way of showing that. What you're looking at here is the years since the last earthquake versus the average recurrence interval for earthquakes. You know that average, of course, in any given time, interval between earthquakes, it varies quite a bit. But on average, this is our estimate. And we had for that Carrizo section, the section 2 up here, until recently, we put it that average rate about 260 years. Of course, it ruptured in 1857. New estimates have moved that to 140 or below, and that puts it in this field of higher probability. Here's another way of looking at the issue of large earthquakes. This is from the USERF report, and this is what we call a frequency magnitude diagram. It's a logarithm of the number of earthquakes versus magnitude, which is, of course, itself a logarithmic measure of size. And what you can see is a series of models here. In 2002, we had a model that showed which we call a bulge, magnitude 6.5 bulge, at intermediate magnitudes relative to the data, which are shown in red. This is the best estimate. These are 95% confidence intervals on the observations, and you can see that this model actually didn't satisfy the observation. The reason for this bulge is that these forecast models typically divide faults up into pieces and assume that these pieces rupture in characteristic earthquakes. And as we have seen from many recent earthquakes, it is very common for ruptures to take place over multiple sections of faults to kind of propagate across what we thought were fault boundaries. That biases the results towards smaller events. So what we think is really going on is that there is a sort of a Gutenberg-Richter type decay, just a simple power law of decay of number versus size. And the new model we think is going to move out take this bulge and move it more to larger magnitude. So you can see from this diagram that MA magnitude 8 is something like an outer scale. 1857 was magnitude 7.9. MA is about the largest earthquake we can imagine in Southern California, and the largest we can accommodate on the southern San Andreas system. Just to show you the way that scaling works, this is kind of a picture supposed to kind of represent the fault part of the San Andreas that broke in the 1906 earthquake. You can see that it's a very large area, about 10,000 square kilometers. The logarithm of the area goes like magnitude. So if you go from magnitude 4, you're talking about 1 square kilometer. You go to magnitude 6, about 100 square kilometers. And for magnitude 8, 10,000 square kilometers. So that's the scaling that we see in earthquake area and fault area. If you look at the slip that occurs on a fault rupture, the average slip typically scales, the logarithm of that scales like 1/2 the magnitude, so that a magnitude 4 would be, say, 5 centimeters, it would be 50 centimeters for magnitude 6, about 5 meters for magnitude 8. Of course, any actual rupture will be very variable in terms of how this slip is distributed over the fault. And that's one of the challenges in terms of the simulations I'm going to talk about. Now, the way we deal with earthquakes, and the way especially people in this department deal with earthquakes, is through probabilistic seismic hazard analysis, which was invented by engineers, not by seismologists. And the way that works is you take an earthquake rupture forecast, showing here the USERC2 forecast. You have an attenuation relationship, and from that you compute some sort of intensity measure. You can get from that hazard curves and hazard maps. This is an example of a probabilistic seismic hazard map for Southern California. This happens to be peak ground acceleration. No numbers actually here, but this is a 2% probability of exceedance in 50 years. Now, part of the issue is what do we do about this attenuation relationship? There are, of course, new versions of attenuation relationships out there. The NGA project has produced a series of those. I'll show you an example later. But what I want to point out here is that when we look at the data on ground motion versus distance and as a function of magnitude, there are places where the data are very sparse, especially in near faults, and there is a lot of scatter in these data. So we try to capture this variation with some sort of empirical ground motion prediction equations, and those are associated with certain probability distributions of exceeding ground motions. Now, we think we understand some of the sources of this scatter and some of the problems associated with the ground motion prediction equations. This is just a map, topographic map of Southern California. You can see the San Andreas here. One of the effects is so-called source directivity. So for example, the 1857 rupture came roaring down from the northwest to the southeast along the San Andreas. And as we'll see in the simulations, that has a very strong effect in terms of essentially focusing energy in the direction of the rupture. The second problem is, of course, the fact that most people live in these flat spots. These are big sedimentary basins. The LA basin is about 8 kilometers thick, and these shake like bowls of jelly in large earthquakes. One of the things I want to talk about is the coupling between rupture directivity and the basin effects. We also have a lot of small-scale geologic variability. You can just sort of see that in the topography here, and that gives rise to a lot of variability in the ground motion. So one of the questions is whether we can use simulations to improve our understanding of how seismic waves attenuate with distance. And we can begin to do large simulations. This is the shakeout simulation that was used for the shakeout exercise in 2008. It's being sped up. Here's the seismological time. And one of the things we learned from that particular simulation, which was for a rupture from the southeast end of the San Andreas up through Cajon Pass to about the mid-Mojave. This would be a scenario of a magnitude 7.8 earthquake, is that you can see this strong directivity effect, these waves being out in front of the rupture here. This is an interference effect. But you'll also notice that the waves have been trapped in these sediments and essentially funneled into the Los Angeles basin, giving rise to large shaking amplitudes in that region. So that's an example of the source directivity basin couple. Okay, now the question is, how can we improve on this sort of classical way of doing business? And what we have done is developed a series of what we call computational pathways to help us use simulations in this. And so just to kind of show you the way these are constructed, we have this nomenclature which I tend to fall back and use. It's useful for us. It's meaningless to other people, but we talk about this pathway. One is being sort of the empirical model, the GMP approach to calculating intensity. What we call pathway 2 is a sort of a physics-based simulation pathway where we have some kinematic fault rupture model that is then used to excite seismic waves that are propagated using an inelastic wave propagation model. And then if the amplitudes are very large, frequencies are high, we may have to deal with nonlinear site response. But from that we can calculate ground motions, and if we have the ground motions in principle, we can calculate whatever intensity measures we are interested in. In practice, this is a very difficult thing to do. One of the issues is really achieving the scale range necessary to model large earthquakes. We have very large outer scale for big earthquakes, large volumes of material that are involved, and we have to worry about things occurring on a very small inner scale associated with the highest frequency waves that are propagated. And the other thing we have to worry about, so that's a computational problem, is, well, this idea of having a fault rupture model. What do we know about fault rupture? Fault rupture is an extremely nonlinear complex process. We often use kinematical representations. We just assume we know what the slip is based upon, say, some statistical description of rupture. But we are involved in improving that, and we can do that via a computational pathway 3, where we actually simulate the ruptures dynamically, putting in the physics of the rupture, the nonlinear physics, the very nonlinear frictional properties of faults, and we have to couple that to wave propagation because the rupture process and seismic waves interact very strongly to give rise to the complexity in the rupture. But we can do that on a smaller scale than, let's say, doing these pathway 2 simulations. So coupling these two pathways, we can gain some real computational leverage on the problem. Now, in order to do those calculations, we need to know the structure in which we are doing the simulation. So we're going to use Southern California as our natural laboratory. We need to know a structural representation for Southern California. That representation has to be in 3 dimensions, and it has to be detailed, especially near the surface. We don't know that a priori. We have to construct that. And part of the way we construct that is to take the observed ground motions and actually invert them for example for the 3-dimensional variation of seismic velocities in a region like Southern California. We typically have to combine a lot of other data in this process. This we call pathway 4. All right, so these are 4 computational pathways. Now, just to give you a little bit of history of this, we started on this project, we got a big grant from the ITR program at NSF in 2002, and we basically had the notion of these pathways at that time, these 4 pathways, and we wanted to develop the computational tools for doing that. What I'm going to show you are some of, just as a kind of a way of moving through time, some of the largest scale simulations we did. We did something called the teraflops simulations in 2004. That's when we sort of discovered how strong the directivity, basin coupling effects actually can be in Southern California. That has to do with the geography and geology of the San Andreas fault, where the process that, the faulting process is actually creating these sedimentary basins, kind of aligning them along the fault, subparallel to the fault, so the effects can be quite strong. We have pursued those kinds of calculations with dynamic ruptures. We have been developing this on a number of the largest computers that we have in the nation through various supercomputer centers. And I'm going to speak today about some of the work we've done in the last couple of years. In particular, just this year, we had a simulation of what we call M8, which is a full-scale, outer-scale simulation for Southern California up to 2 Hertz. So that's the most ambitious simulation we've done. That was done on Jaguar, the world's currently, well, it's not the fastest computer. The computer that was unveiled in China is nominally faster, but Jaguar is the fastest one we have access to. And we will be pursuing this program I'm going to describe to you on the new Blue Waters machine when that is developed in 2011 to 2012. And we are extending this program out into the future. This has turned out to be a very large collaboration. The people here at USC have been especially important. For example, our colleagues like Carl Kesselman and Eva Dielman over at ISI have been critical to the project. We have been very involved in using the USC high-performance computing facilities. But as you can see from this picture of logo land here, that a number of the other computing centers are involved. San Diego Supercomputer Center, we have very close ties to and work very closely with them, and all these other entities. By using these large machines, we've been able to improve the performance of our calculations substantially. That teraflops calculation I mentioned in 2004 actually ran at a sustained rate of 0.2 teraflops, right? This was on a teraflop machine, but trying to get the very complex computational codes to run at a sustained rate that approaches that speed is, of course, very difficult. We have recently, with Jaguar, achieved 200 teraflops in the latest runs for a sustained run of 24 hours. So we have been able to increase use computers that increase the effective computing speed by a factor of 1,000 in the last 6 years. So we're basically going from terascale to petascale computing in that time. Now, these codes, as I say, are complex in terms of some of their details. Basically, we're solving a wave equation. We also have to worry about the inelastic attenuation of those waves, and we have efficient schemes for doing this, very efficient schemes that allow us to do these calculations. I won't go into the details of this. But I did want to point out, this is the formulation for a particular code. It's called the Inelastic Wave Propagation Code, or AWP. ODC stands for Kim Olson, Steve Day, and Yifeng Cui, who are three of our colleagues at San Diego State for these two guys, and San Diego Supercomputer for Yifeng, who have worked very closely together and with us to develop these highly efficient codes. And this shows some of the scaling results we've been able to obtain over the last 6 years. And what you're looking at here is what's called strong scaling. So we're basically looking at, if we take a problem of fixed size, increase the number of cores that are processors that we're using. We ideally would follow a dashed line like this. When we first started on this particular set of calculations, the TerraShake calculations, we lost our scaling. We went to a number of 1,000 cores. But by doing some careful I/O optimization, we were able to bring it back into almost the linear scaling. And you can see that history being repeated as we go out to a larger number of cores, bigger machines, where we will have a problem, lose the scaling, and then are able to correct it. So for example, I/O optimization, we've been now employing asynchronous communications among the cores and within the machine that very much improve the scaling. And as we go up to these very large machines, we get improvements for using fancy techniques, different types of optimizations, different types of communication optimizations. This is just what is called weak scaling, where we are actually increasing the size of the problem with the number of cores, and you can see we retain this flat character, which means that we can, as we go out to more and more cores, we can run bigger and bigger problems. So we're out now working on Jaguar with 223,000 processors, and I'll show you an example of that simulation. It's what we call M8. It was done in May. We are doing other simulations. This is actually a production run, meaning that it's not just to demonstrate that we can do this. It actually is a science run, and it's one we expect to be repeating, looking through parameter space and examine some of the issues. But look at the scale of the problem. We're dealing with a fault length, this entire southern San Andreas fault from essentially Parkfield, California, down to Bombay Beach on the Salton Sea, 545 kilometers. We are looking at minimum wavelengths of only 200 meters, which requires that we sample the geologic structure at 40-meter spacing. We're going to be looking at the results for a northwest to southeast propagating rupture. I showed you the shakeout, which was in the opposite direction, going down this way on the San Andreas. And the interaction of this kind of fault rupture with the very complex character of the sedimentary basins that are distributed across Southern California. This calculation was partitioned, as I mentioned, into two steps. The first step is the pathway 3 step, where we do the dynamic rupture. That was done on a machine called Kraken. It's itself a large machine. It was a very large, one of the largest, I think the largest dynamic rupture simulation we've done to date. And you can see some of the statistics here, requiring a we have to basically break up the fault surface into very small regions in order to be able to represent the complexity of the rupture process. The wave propagation or pathway 2 simulation was done on Jaguar. As I said, it's a 24-hour run. It was amazing because we don't have checkpointing in these calculations. It's too inefficient to implement checkpointing on these big machines. So you've got to just keep your fingers crossed that 223,000 processors are going to run together for 24 hours without one of them essentially dying. That happened. So I should say dying didn't happen. So that's how we were able to get this simulation completed, 220 teraflops sustained rate on a real science calculation. There were 436 billion grid points that represented the geologic model. That's down to an inner scale of 40 meters, an outer scale of 800 kilometers, minimum shear wave velocity of 40 meters per second, and we calculated 386 seconds of ground motion with time steps of 0.002 seconds. So if you take the four-dimensional volume of the outer, the part of the Earth that we're simulating, 800 by 400 by almost 100 kilometers, multiply that out, multiply out the total time we're simulating, and divide by the inner scale, which is the smallest volume we're representing in space-time. It turns out that 4D scale ratio is 7 times 10 to the 16. So that shows you the tremendous scale range that we have to employ in these simulations. This is a picture of the dynamic rupture simulation. What you're looking at in the top graph is the final slip. This shows you the horizontal peak slip rates. This shows you the rupture velocity relative to the shear velocity. And this is important for the simulation I'll be showing you because the red regions here correspond to when the rupture is propagating faster than the shear wave velocity. It's what we call super shear. Normally we think of earthquakes as propagating at sub-shear below some upper velocity, which is effectively the Rayleigh wave velocity. So this would be typical for ruptures. But what these simulations show, and what we're seeing in more and more earthquakes, is evidence for super shear propagation. And that's very important because it completely changes the character of the ground motion that's radiated. So in this particular simulation, it has several places where it goes super shear, and you'll see that in the simulation I'll show you. So let's take a look at this animation. We're going to be looking at the essentially the magnitude of the horizontal velocities. The simulation starts up in Hartfield, breaks out, it goes super shear. You can see, we'll come back and look at the details. You can see how the directivity effect, energy being pushed out in front of the rupture, exciting these sedimentary basins, and getting large pulses of energy as we look at the heterogeneity of the rupture process. So let's go back and look at that in a little bit more detail. I'll stop at various points. So this is at the very beginning. What happens is the fault nucleates at depth, ruptures to the surface, and it goes immediately super shear. And that gives a very large pulse of energy that emerges right at the surface. Propagates down the fault at super shear speed. And you can see that because this wavefront here is V-shaped. It's a Mach cone. It's a shock wave that's being the rupture is faster than the shear wave velocity, so you're developing a shock front, and that gives rise to these large velocities and different character of the ground motions from that part of the rupture. Let's carry it down a little bit further. Here it turns the corner, comes into the Mojave. It goes super shear again. See how this developing this V thing. The other thing you can see is that because of the directivity effect, this energy being pushed out in front of the rupture is now coupling into the basins. This happens to be the Santa Clara River, and this ridge of high ground motions is essentially a love wave that is being excited within this very deep sedimentary basin that extends from Santa Clara down to Ventura. We keep that going to the next stopping point. Now, of course, we're at enough time to where the time, you can see the time over here. That's a little hard to read. This is, can you read that?
91.5.
Yeah, something like that. You can see that now you're getting the San Fernando Valley is excited. You can see these very long period waves propagating through the Los Angeles Basin region. One of the things I learned from these simulations, you don't want to live in San Bernardino. San Bernardino is a sedimentary basin right on the San Andreas fault. You get very strong coupling into that basin, very strong basin effects there. You can see strong ground motion continuing in the Los Angeles region. It goes super shear again, the rupture. Gives rise to large ground motions in the Coachella Valley. Notice that Los Angeles is still leaping along here. And then there's a very big pulse of energy associated with the stopping phase. In fact, when a fault stops, you get a lot of radiation from the fact of the deceleration of the rupture front. And that sends a bunch of energy out into the Mexicali region down the Imperial Valley. Okay, so this is an earthquake we definitely would prefer not to be in. Yeah, question?
Is this all, I mean, so, pardon my ignorance, but is this all strike slip? Because
Yeah.
it takes that kink. So wouldn't, if you got strike slip in the northern front, wouldn't it kind of want to build the San Gabriel Mountains? Wouldn't it
Well,
kind of just
yeah,
butt into that kink?
That's a good question. Namely, along a rupture, we have assumed for this particular simulation that the fault is essentially vertical. When we look at the San Andreas fault, we see it is in most places nearly vertical. There are places, however, out here in the San Gorgonio area where the fault has complexities that are not properly represented by this model. And in fact, it's those complexities that are involved in building these mountains. Okay, so you're quite right in that we don't have all of the complexity, geometrical complexity that we would expect. One of the interesting computational challenges is to put in different types of complexity because, for example, the calculations to be done here on a just a perfectly structured grid, this is a rectangular grid or cubic grid. In order to deal with complexity, we have to have distorted meshes. We have work being done with finite element codes, with finite difference codes that allow for distortion of grids, and so there's a lot of development still to be done to fully represent that kind of complexity. Okay, here is just to point out that although we're all nervous about the San Andreas fault, if we look over the last 100 years, essentially all the damaging earthquakes in Southern California have not been on the San Andreas fault. They've been on a fault subsidiary to the San Andreas. So to really deal with the problem of seismic hazards, we can't just focus on the San Andreas. It's a nice big fault and famous and so forth. But we have to be able to worry about all of these mini faults. Of course, faults actually form a fractal network, uncountably large number, I suppose. But I've heard it said there are 300 active faults in Southern California. I think that 300 comes from faults with large enough segments to be recognized on, I don't know, maybe Jennings map or something. But we have many, many faults. And in fact, you can see that, it's coming back to this USURF model, the 30-year probability, remember that for the rupture I just showed you, the M8, the probability is very small, 2% in USURF 2, maybe a little bit higher given the new information, but there's a much higher probability of having smaller earthquakes. In fact, what scares me is not the fact that the San Andreas fault is going to rupture in one large earthquake, but the fact that we are going to get a large rupture on the San Andreas fault, let's say part of the San Andreas fault, and then that's going to be a big earthquake. We're going to say we had our big one, and people like me are going to have to stand up and say, sorry, you had one of your big ones. In other words, we worry about the San Andreas fault actually having a sequence of large earthquakes as we've observed on faults like the North Anatolian fault. And we need to better understand those types of earthquake sequences. Well, to do that, we have to be able to represent the faults. This is the so-called SCEC community fault model. This is the Los Angeles region here. I'm not sure you can see the coastline coming here, this white line, but just a mare's nest of faults in the Los Angeles region, out in the Mojave and other parts of California. And we need to be able to represent ruptures on all of those faults. Again, we like to be able to do this from a probabilistic point of view. We can't predict earthquakes. We try to assign probabilities to earthquakes based on our best understanding of how often faults rupture, when they last ruptured, and so forth. We clearly have to take a probabilistic approach. Now, to do that, using this physics-based pathway means we have to do a lot of simulations. We have to essentially sample in the distribution of possible sources that we might have. And we have a project called CyberShake, in which we try to do that. I haven't explained the term an extended rupture forecast, but basically earthquake rupture forecasts that are ready-made, like USURF 2, don't actually have enough information to be able to derive simulations. We're hoping future forecasts will. But one example is that these forecasts will tell you that a certain section of a fault has a certain probability of rupturing, but it doesn't tell you anything about the probability of that fault nucleating at one end versus nucleating at the other end versus nucleating in the middle and rupturing bilaterally. We have to make assumptions about that. In the calculation I'm going to show you, we assume that essentially all ruptures on a given fault are equally possible. What we can do is calculate seismograms, and we can do this efficiently using a concept known as seismic reciprocity, and do this for a very large number of faults, and actually get out the time histories for seismograms. So here's examples of some of the larger faults in the CyberShake data set, fault rupture set. This is, we sort of getting ourselves call this the Big Ten. I think there's actually 11 faults on here. And what you're looking at here is examples of the source complexity shown here by the slip distribution on a given fault. You can see there are patches of high slip versus patches of low slip. And again, we've got to be able to sample that in some probabilistic way to represent the source complexity. Now, to do that, in the calculations that I'm going to show you, we've got about 600,000 ruptures that are used to represent earthquakes generated by 13,000 sections of fault in Southern California. In order to do that efficiently, we have to use seismic reciprocity, and I'm not going to explain in great technical detail, but just point out that here's the problem. We've got 600,000 earthquakes, and we're going to be simulating it for a set of 225 sites in the Los Angeles region. So the number of ruptures we're going to simulate is much larger than the number of sites that we have. If we had to do a separate simulation for each of these ruptures, it would take a lot of computer time. It still does, but we can turn it around and do the following. If you imagine having a series of earthquakes that generate waves that are received at a receiver, which shows 3 of them here, you can calculate the ground motion at the receiver for each of those from a seismic representational equation. This is a Green's function, and this specifies the source. These Green's functions have, what it requires, it's going to require m sources to n receivers will require m simulations. But we have a symmetry property of the Green's function, essentially time reversal symmetry, that allows us to rewrite this in terms of something we call a receiver Green's tensor. It's a third order tensor. And we can calculate the displacement at that receiver by essentially doing a series of 3 simulations for different point forces at this receiver, calculating the Green's function, and then integrating over each of these sources, just simply integrating the Green's function over the sources by a simple quadrature algorithm. And so what that does is reduces the problem to requiring only 3 n simulations. And in this case, m is 600,000 and n is 225. So you can see that our savings is about a factor of 1,000. And that allows us to do these calculations. So what I'm showing you is, I said 600,000 simulations. That turns out to be about 440,000 simulations per site. Some sites, some earthquakes are far enough away from sites you don't have to simulate them. This took 5.5 million CPU hours. It was a 50-day run on a machine called Ranger at the Texas Advanced Computer Center. It was 189 million jobs that were managed via a scientific workflow system that was developed by Eva Dielman and her colleagues at ISI. Involved a lot of output data, a lot of archive data in the terabyte range. And what comes out of this is essentially 880,000 seismograms per site, the 2 components, horizontal motion. And we can then go in and treat this in a probabilistic way. We can kind of push it through probabilistic seismic hazard analysis, and we can develop a seismic hazard map. So this is the map for the Los Angeles region. We'd be about right here. Here's Palo Base. So here's the San Andreas fault. And I'll compare this map to One of the, this happens to be a map by Campbell and Borzonia, one of the so-called NGA models that was published in 2008. This is the CyberShake 2009 model. If I were to compare it with the other NGAs, what you would see is that CyberShake is similar to these empirical ground motion prediction equations, except in the sedimentary basins. And in the basins, CyberShake invariably forecasts higher ground motions than these models, including ones like Campbell and Borzonia that attempt to represent basin effects. So we think the reason for that is because of the strong directivity basin coupling that we see in the simulations. We want to proceed towards a statewide hazard model and kind of scale this up. We're going to have a new USURF model. USURF 3 is going to be released in June of 2012. If we were to do the same scale of calculation for California as we did for the Los Angeles region, it would be about 4,000 sites, and this gives you the numbers of what we would need. It's about 750 million CPU hours. This is a ridiculous amount of computer time, but remember that people are developing these really big machines. There's a lot of CPUs out there, and we are getting access to those as they're being developed. If we did this on one half of the Jaguar machine, we could do this in only 4,000 hours. Okay? And on the new Blue Waters machine, it would be only 770 hours for one half of the machine. But I think by any measure, this is exascale computing we're trying to do. So we're going to be scaling up by a factor of 1,000 from the petascale that we are currently. Now, I've shown you a bunch of simulations. I talked about how we do this modeling, but we have to remember that this process involves not just simulation, but we of course have to. That's simply the model prediction step, but we have to worry about validating these simulations. And when we compare them with real data, we find they aren't as good as we'd like, so we need to assimilate that data into our systems. We need to verify that what we're doing is correct, we're solving the physics correctly, and the codes work and so forth, and then we can resimulate, revalidate, and kind of move out on this spiral of scientific inference associated with these system science problems. And as you do that, it requires better data, that requires more computation, and you need better theory, that requires more computation. So our computer, here is a verification step where we're using 3 different codes, running at 3 different supercomputer centers to simulate a particular earthquake. This is a shakeout simulation. We've done an extensive series of these types of simulations, and that helps us verify that these codes are doing what we think they should be doing. The validation problem of saying, well, that's fine, the codes do what you think they're doing, but do they do what the Earth does? That's a much harder problem to solve. And the problem, of course, is we don't actually have any observations of these big earthquakes, at least instrumentally, that we can use to validate our simulations. We do in other places, but we don't in our main laboratory in Southern California. Well, the Omayor-Kukupau earthquake, which just happened on Easter Sunday, is a type of we look at very carefully and are trying to use that. Unfortunately, it was often on northern Baja, down where we didn't have many seismic stations, so we're trying to simulate what happened when the waves came up into the U.S. Here's one way we can attempt to do the validation. These rocks were eroded in place. They're essentially granite masses that have been jointed and fractured and then eroded, and certain of these rocks are just sitting there very precariously balanced. You can go and push them over with your hand, and you can also model them very carefully and say what kinds of earthquake ground motions would knock them over. So that gives you at least some way to bound the ground motions that we can observe at certain sites. These little blue sites here are precariously balanced rock sites. You can see a series of them in Southern California. And one thing you'll notice is that what's plotted here on the main map is one of these NGAs. This I think happens to be, this is probably Warren Atkinson's NGA model. And you'll see that the CyberShake model tends to have these rock sites at lower ground motion values than the NGA models. And that's good because if earthquakes happened according to the current earthquake forecast and the current NGA models, it would knock over most of these rocks. Since those rocks are still there, suggests that the ground motions are too high. Another way we can validate is to use small earthquakes. We have many small earthquakes in California, such as the little Geno Hills event. How many people felt the Geno Hills? I was teaching a class summer to a bunch of interns. It was kind of fun. Here. Kind of earthquake that doesn't hurt many people and shakes everybody up, makes people think carefully about what's going on. What we have done is used that earthquake for some of our validation experiments, and this shows simulations in red that are going up to 2 hertz. So we're going up now higher in frequency than we typically have in the past on the simulations, trying to model a higher frequency energy. Of course, at those high frequencies, the waves are being strongly scattered, especially in the near surface environment, so we don't expect to be able to model them wiggle for wiggle. However, what we find is that we get, with some exceptions, we are doing pretty good in terms of, for example, peak ground velocities and other sort of characteristic aspects of the ground motion. And one of the things we're concluding is that a lot of the scattering that's taking place at high frequencies is really occurring in the very near surface layers. And that's good in the sense that those are layers that we can investigate more easily and get more information about, and perhaps be able to model those scattering effects better using deterministic methods. Well, we want to be able to take those data and build them back, kind of assimilate them back into our model. To do that is a big inverse problem. I don't have time to talk about. This is work actually that my group here at USC has been very involved in. This is from Po Chen, who is now a professor at the University of Wyoming, trying to take the data up to about 1 hertz for all of these small earthquakes in Southern California at all of these stations, and look at the difference between the synthetic and the observed waveforms, measure aspects of that difference, take that and invert that for a better 3-dimensional velocity model. We now are beginning to get those 3D models. That is a really big simulation problem. It's essentially as big as the CyberShake problem in terms of the amount of computer time that it takes. Well, the Southern California Earthquake Center just got refunded for another 5-year period, 2012 to 2017. So part of what we propose to earn that refunding is to set up some pretty ambitious research goals, and in particular to work with a lot of our colleagues in the federal agencies, state agencies, and engineering to begin to look at some of the practical, using some of these science tools to perhaps give us better information that we can use to reduce seismic risk, improve resiliency, and so forth. What you're looking at here is on a very nonlinear time scale, kind of a diagram of what an earthquake cascade looks like. There are lots of things that happen before the earthquake. We can't as yet use this information to do anything like predicting earthquakes, but this is the kind of information we use to try and better forecast earthquakes. It's a hot topic in seismology these days. Once the fault rupture happens, of course, there's all kinds of cascade of effects through not only the natural environment, but obviously the built environment. And these are, of course, a great concern to us here in Southern California. There are technologies that these simulations can contribute to that will help us in this respect. So here are 5 of them identified. We talked about long-term seismic hazard modeling that gives us information on timescales of decades to centuries. We, in advance of events, and so provides information needed to build structures to withstand seismic disasters. Post-event information and response for response and recovery is also something that's been highly developed. As you probably know, the seismic networks in places like California are capable of producing shake maps that show the distribution of shaking with reasonable accuracy across Southern California within minutes or less of an earthquake happening. But there are, and you probably also know that in Northern California there's a lot of effort on tsunami warning and the Cascadia and so forth. But here are 2 technologies that we still have to develop, what we call operational earthquake forecasting and earthquake early warning. Operational forecasting essentially being short-term earthquake forecasting, building in kind of up-to-the-minute information, trying to deal with seismic weather, not just seismic climate. And the way we do that is by using the fact that earthquakes are clustered in space and time. Big earthquakes have aftershocks, But generally speaking, there are pretty well-defined statistics that describe how earthquakes are statistically related to other earthquakes. And that can be used to improve our short-term forecasting. Earthquake early warning is, of course, once an earthquake happens, trying to detect that it's happened and be able to transmit the fact that an earthquake is happening further away so that people can anticipate the strong ground motion. I just want to show you how CyberShake can be used, a quick illustration, for this short-term earthquake forecasting. So we'll look at the southern San Andreas, and CyberShake, of course, models many earthquakes on the southern San Andreas. We've had a couple of events such as Parkfield in 2004, Bombay Beach in 2009, that were right close to the San Andreas, and